Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the summit. I'm really happy today to have North Dakota Senator Josh Boschee. As he's going to be doing a presentation just kind of about talking about working with your state legislators. We've been very fortunate to work with Josh over the last, I think, 4 years. It's been now since we've been talking to each other. And I think he'll have some great insight for everybody. And so if you have questions, remember everybody's muted and you can put your questions in the chat and we will get to them after the presentation. So thank you again, Josh, for being here. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Chris, and good to be with everyone this afternoon. I'm beaming in from Fargo, North Dakota. And as Chris indicated, we've had the privilege of working together over the last 4 years. I serve in the state Senate currently. I've been serving there the last 2 years here, represent downtown Fargo and North Fargo. And prior to that, I served 12 years in the state House. And so my work with Chris and chasing wild horse advocates began when I served in the House and now has continued over into the Senate. Um, One of my background is prior to being elected to state off or the state legislature, I worked in higher education. At two local universities here, North Dakota State University and Minnesota State University Moorhead. And what I love most about my role as a legislator is engaging people and getting them involved with the political process. My introduction to policy and politics was in campaigns and organizing dating back to 2008. And so, any chance I get an opportunity to have conversations with folks like you all today about how do you engage in the legislative process or how do you make impactful change in your communities, I try to jump on it because it's been such an important part of my own journey in making change in my community and making sure that voices are heard on issues that are important to a variety of people. Um, so yeah, with that, I do have a little bit of a slideshow to keep me focused on my conversation with you all, but we'll certainly have time for questions. And if you have questions as we're going, please, raise your hand or come off mute and shout it out. I'm happy to engage with you as part of that. So just want to confirm, are you guys seeing the slideshow or the PowerPoint?
Yes, we can see it.
Great, great. So like I said, I'm in North Dakota. We border Minnesota, South Dakota, and Montana, and we all have different ways that our legislative process works. So, recognizing that those of you that are joining us today are from different parts of the United States and in different states, not just here in North Dakota, recognizing that processes are different, and some of that works to the favor of certain of the legislative process, and other times that might work against you because it makes the process more challenging in some states than others. But one thing I think that's important is, our states continue to be laboratories of democracy. Over the last decade or so, we have seen more and more engagement at the state level by advocacy groups and less focus on federal legislation or Congress itself. The reason being is as Congress continues to get more and more at a stalemate in a variety of ways. We've seen more and more shutdowns of the federal government because of budget issues in the last decade or so across administrations, Democrat, Republican. It doesn't matter. We're just seeing that Congress isn't coming to compromise as much as we used to, and so that takes us back to the states. And certainly, there's a philosophy, specifically within our 10th Amendment, the power of the states. But a lot of folks, specifically advocacy groups, whether it's powerful and rich corporations to nonprofit advocacy groups working on healthcare or environmental issues, education, what be it. Are putting more resources into state level engagement. And part of that is because the idea that if they can get more states to pass similar policies, then they have the bargaining power to go to Congress and say, we've had 10 states pass this. And again, in the instance of the work that I've done with Chris and the advocates, it's around, protecting our wild horse herds, specifically in Theodore Roosevelt National Park, but of course in public lands across the United States, as this collaboration of folks. You all represent different areas and probably have your own communities that are doing some of this work. And states have been able to be testing grounds of diverse ideas, of trying things. One of the key things that, the resolution and the legislation that Chris and I have worked on here in North Dakota was the idea of an in-state working group, for instance. And that was a model that was borrowed from Colorado, who was working with, I believe, not just the Park Service, but the Forest Service and BLM in terms of making sure that there were stakeholders from within Colorado who were advocating on behalf of the herd there, and had a spot officially at the table. So that was something we modeled in our legislation, and I know Chris continues to work on at the federal level to make sure that North Dakotans have a voice in the management of our herd here in Teddy Roosevelt National Park. But then also different legislative processes can lead to different outcomes. One thing that I will say time and time again throughout the legislative process, and for especially for those of you that are new to the process or have done legislative advocacy for a long time, is really just celebrating the small wins. Sometimes in legislative process, coming in, and of course we have this goal of trying to pass something or defeat a bad bill, um, but sometimes progress is seen at getting it to the next mile marker for the next legislative session. And so what that looks like is different for each state based on the legislative process. But I'll talk a little bit about what that looked like in North Dakota, and then of course how that compares to how I know some different states are structured in their legislative process. One thing I always encourage folks to do, of course, is to introduce themselves to their policymakers. Um, I was first elected in 2012, so my first legislative session was in 2013. But shortly after I was elected, a now constituent reached out to me and said, me and my wife would like to meet you for coffee to learn who you are and to share who we are. So we met at a coffee shop not too far from my home, and they just wanted to introduce themselves and say, we are a family that does homeschooling, and so we pay attention to legislation as it relates to education and the ability to do homeschooling in our state. And so, we just want to spend some time getting to know you, share who we are, and hopefully be a resource for you. And that's always stuck with me because of my different beliefs and whatnot, homeschooling has obviously evolved a lot in the last decade since I've served, but at that time it wasn't something that I had thought much about, but, generally thought that, homeschooling maybe wasn't the best way to educate kids. But I've been able to learn a lot from those parents, not just the two that sat down with me, but more that I've met in my district. And, we've been able to work on legislation. Some of it I've supported of the things they've asked. Other times I've not supported. But just that relationship was a way for me to meet someone in my district to kind of cut through some of the noise in terms of, the advocacy groups are strongly supporting something or opposed to it. And so I just encourage folks to do that, especially in the off season. So often, we as policymakers are engaged very highly by people when we're in the middle of the legislative process, right? And that's generally when people are activated because something is happening, right? A bill has been introduced that you want to support, or an idea has been introduced that you need to oppose or fix, maybe whittle it down a little bit so it's not as impactful or harmful or provides more opportunity, depending on your perspective. But by having those relationships before the legislative process, really, I think helps bring down that tenor and the guard that legislators may have in regards to, okay, I have a half hour to have this meeting with someone. They're here to advocate on behalf of wild horses. I visited Teddy Roosevelt National Park once when I was a kid. That was a great experience, but haven't really thought about it much since. But having those conversations before we get into the legislative process, I think is certainly beneficial to the things that you're advocating on behalf of. Most states right now are going into a legislative process. They would have started in January and some are starting in February. North Dakota, we meet every other year. So we met January through the first week of May of 2025. And outside of an emergency kind of special session we just had last week, we don't meet for a year and a half then. And so there's a year and a half in between each legislative session generally that would allow North Dakotans to engage with legislators, especially because we're back home. We're not in Bismarck. We're back in the neighborhoods and the communities that we live in and represent. So for you to think about that as you think about legislation, whether it's stuff you're going to be introducing this session, or maybe you're planning for the 2027 legislative year, using this summer or the spring or time well before that to introduce yourself to your policymakers once you identify who they are. And I encourage you to schedule a one-on-one, if you're able to do that. Again, in our legislative process in North Dakota, I don't have staff. I answer my own emails and phone calls, and that's how Chris and I got connected with one another several years ago. But some of your legislators, I think of my colleagues in places like Florida or Pennsylvania or Virginia. They have very large operations and staff that specialize in different things. So it may not be necessarily introducing yourself to the senator or the representative, but certainly the opportunity to get to know the staff person who would work on have the issues that you're advocating on behalf of in their portfolio, and again letting them know that you're a resource to them, but also listening to their priorities. There's an opportunity through that listening to find common ground. Learning more about that member or that legislator, may open up some opportunities for other conversations or similarities that help break down that kind of transactional piece of policy making, where it's I'm here to ask you to do something, but we share a connection in the fact that we both have grandchildren, or that we went to the same college or high school. Just trying to find those common grounds as part of building that relationship and breaking down the transactional aspect of policy making. Another great way is really just showing up to their community events. It may not be an event that is focused on the issue you're advocating on behalf of, but being able to meet them a kind of neutral ground or at one of their events helps them remember who you are, that you're paying attention, you're engaged. I think of I'm in a neighborhood, what we consider a core neighborhood in Fargo. So we're organized around our elementary schools, and we have neighborhood associations. Some of the oldest houses in the community are here. And so the Roosevelt Neighborhood Association has been in existence for a long time because 25 years ago, the school board was going to close one of our schools. The community and neighborhood rallied. We were able to keep the school open. Well, the Roosevelt Neighborhood Association still regularly goes to city commission meetings, and they wear their red T-shirts. It's usually two women, and they just sit in the back of the room. And it's just a reminder to our city council members that the neighborhood's paying attention. And it may not be anything on the agenda that has anything to do with our neighborhood association or anything that we're advocating, but just a reminder that we're there and participating in the legislative process at the local level. So if you need anything, reach out, or, don't try to sneak anything by because we're watching, which ends up being more of the case. So let's see here. Okay. Again, like I said, each state has a different legislative process. In North Dakota, we would be probably, from my understanding and the work that I've done with legislators across the country, we're probably like the least restrictive legislative process out there. And what I mean by that is in North Dakota, every bill gets a hearing. So every bill that gets introduced or resolution has the opportunity to have a hearing, which then in turn allows the public to engage in the process. Most states, it's not that open. There's usually some sort of gatekeeper or a process that has to happen before a bill might secure a hearing. So, for instance, in Minnesota, the committee chair of the Committee of Jurisdiction has most of the power to determine whether a bill will get a hearing. So advocates in Minnesota generally are trying to build relationships, not just with the legislators on that committee or the legislators from their key communities, but also the chairperson of those key committees or the Committee of Jurisdiction. In North Dakota, like I said, I introduced a bill or a legislation and it's going to have a hearing. Now, what happens in that hearing may change, or whether it's successful, that's yet to be determined. But at least the advocates or the opponents of the legislation have the opportunity to have their voices be heard as part of our process. Um, Additionally, in North Dakota, we do not vote up. We don't kill or pass legislation in committee. Our job is to provide a recommendation to the body. So if it's a House bill introduced in the House, so for instance, generally anything to do with our wild horses would probably go in front of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. So that committee would have a hearing, and then that committee would make a do pass or a do not pass recommendation to the House of Representatives. And then the State House of Representatives has the ability to have, or ends up having, a discussion about the bill, and the committee determines, and it might be a split vote. It's on the House side, that's a 14-member committee. So it might have been an 8-6 do not pass recommendation. So that signals to the body that there's, you know, quite a bit of, well, it's a split understanding. So maybe there's some merits to pay attention to and ask some questions. Um, in other states, the committee might, or the committee itself might kill the bill. So in South Dakota, they have a process, and I'll get the day wrong, but the committee might just move the bill to what they call the 51st legislative day, which doesn't exist. And so it's a procedural move that sends the bill to be considered on that 51st day, which that 51st day never exists. So it's essentially the committee killing it. And it's a way that, especially for very controversial legislation, a committee that is trying to make sure that there's not a recorded vote, or not putting their members in the position of voting on something very controversial, are able to defeat the bill so that it doesn't get the full vote, and put sometimes members in a difficult position, especially again with highly controversial legislation. But very commonly, what I see across the country is the committee chairs are the ones that determine what bills can get introduced, and then the schedule of those bills. So again, that's an opportunity as you build a relationship with folks, putting in a request to a committee chair or their staff to say, it would be really helpful if this bill was heard on Thursday, January 28th, because we are doing, a drive-in that day. We already have 30 members of our organization that are going to be here. So if we can align the bill hearing with that, we would appreciate that. Then it's up to the committee chair, the committee staff, whether that happens or not. But the power of those relationships helps with that. In several states, multiple committees might have jurisdiction. So it might go to a natural resources committee first if it's related to wild horses in the state. But then maybe there's an appropriation. So then that policy committee has to pass it off to an appropriations committee. Or some states have a whole separate rules or scheduling committee. So once it passes a committee or comes out of a committee favorably, it goes to basically a gatekeeper committee of leadership, or senior ranking legislators, who then determine when it'll be heard on the chamber floor, and where it might fall in the grand scheme of the other priorities happening that session. Other things you want to pay attention to is what are the specific timelines of the bill. Again, in our state here in North Dakota, we have a deadline of when bills can be introduced. So it keeps our process moving forward. Again, like I said, every bill gets a hearing. So generally by the third week of January, we want to make sure every bill that's being introduced is introduced, and then it's getting a part of the committee process and voted on. Because of how we're limited in the number of days to meet. But in some states where your legislators might be full-time professional policymakers, you might have an entire year for the bill to be heard. So it gets introduced in January, but may not be scheduled for a hearing until May, and all appropriation bills have to be out by July. So you can kind of figure out that cadence, and if you're fortunate to have a relationship with the folks who can help guide that, whether it's members of that committee or the committee chair, to determine the process of that bill. And then, of course, what is the process for public testimony? Different states have different rules as it relates to in-person testimony, virtual testimony, which has become more and more common after COVID. Again, here in North Dakota, we generally allow virtual testimony, especially because we're a highly rural state. And in February, you never know which blizzard's going to hit on a Monday that the bill hearing might be. But it's up to the discretion of the committee chair. So some committees, the chairs are fine with allowing virtual testimony, and they'll generally say that anyone in the room gets to speak first, and if we have time, then we'll go to virtual testimony. Other committee chairs won't allow virtual testimony at all. So you have to make sure that you have folks coordinated to be there. And of course, in a state like North Dakota, it's trying to manage the weather. But for you and your states, there might be other things you have to manage or try to figure out that schedule in terms of when folks can participate in the process. Once the bill gets through the committee and moves on, hopefully in the affirmative, to be voted on by the full body, then it's a matter of then also understanding the time frame. Again, does your state legislative process require that a bill is heard on the floor within 48 hours of it leaving a committee? Some it might be they only vote on bills on Tuesdays and Thursdays, because members are back in their districts on Mondays and Fridays. So we've seen a variety of different ways there, but just to understand, okay, we got it through committee. Now, will it be voted on the floor? And as it comes to the floor vote, a lot of times, especially folks who are just getting involved in advocacy, end up focusing a lot on trying to get all the votes that they can get. So if you're trying to get a bill passed, you want all the yes votes you can get. But one thing I've had to learn and often help others try to understand is you just need 50% plus one sometimes. And that's the process in our state. Other states, you might need 2/3. So again, understanding what your vote count needs to be, but then working backwards from there. And so again, when Chris and I worked on some legislation, part of that was what we call counting noses or whipping votes, right? Trying to figure out, all right, these 10 legislators have always been with us. We just need to confirm that they'll vote for it. Great. We have 10 of the 24 we need. These 10 are maybe 3 of these people are from that district. So let's try to lock them in with some. So we put together our strategy of how do we get to our count of 24. And anyone above that is great. If we can get to 28, 30, awesome, because then when the House sees that, they'll see that there's fairly good support. But understanding that, having a strategy of trying to get to the win number is more effective than just trying to maybe shotgun all of that. And that's really where you can tap into your members, right? When you look at if you're an established organization that has a membership list, or that you have a concentration of supporters in different areas, it's, being able to activate those members to talk to key legislators or specific legislators from their district, right? So it's a way, again, that you can make it really grassroots for folks to, again, engage with their legislator about an issue that's important to them. Because again, I'm from Fargo. I'm on the complete opposite side of Teddy Roosevelt National Park of the state. So one of the jokes in the legislature is, why does the guy from Fargo care so much about the horses? And as I've gotten to know more about the horses, I also understand that I love when people come to visit North Dakota. And generally they're coming through a place like Fargo to get to the eastern or western side of the state. So not only the value of the horses and the history and the culture of our state, but also the economic impacts and the fact that the more people we can get to come visit North Dakota instead of South Dakota, because everywhere I go, they think that I'm from Mount Rushmore, and I have to remind them that's South Dakota. I'm North Dakota. Come see Teddy Roosevelt National Park. It is a great opportunity. But often, because of things that might be geographic, or, if you have an urban rural state, your urban legislators might not be as focused on issues that are happening out in, again, places where state parks and Forest Service and BLM lands are at. So, having your members really engage with those folks so that they see that there is a constituency of people in my community who care about, in this case, talking about wild horses and preserving them on our public lands. and then trying to line up which legislators will speak, and that's again kind of a strategy point. But as Chris and I have tried to advocate, we really tried to make it a local conversation. So while certainly I've been helping lead from behind the scenes on things, it's how do we help stand up the legislators from the districts that the wild horses exist in. It can be a win for those legislators. They might have other priorities that they're working on, but if we can help get it to the 10-yard line for them, and then on the Senate or the House floor, they're the ones that try to champion it. That becomes a win for them and their communities. So really trying to make sure that we have people lined up to speak in the affirmative, or if you're trying to defeat it, obviously someone who's going to speak against a bill. I'm going to take a little break there. Any questions or comments from your own experience of doing some of this advocacy?
Um, Josh, maybe can you talk about a little bit? Because I think that we all, whether it's like state or federal legislators, we all assume that you know everything, and you have all the knowledge about things. So even when it comes to issues, and I like to use the example that I think the last legislative session, weren't there like over 1,000 pieces of legislation you guys went through? There's no way that one person could know the ins and outs of every piece of all of that. So just how important is it to have good, solid information? And then also for us to also, I know we did this a lot when we had testimony, finding credible people to testify in front of the committee. So can you speak to that a little bit? Just
No, that's great. Yeah, in our example here in North Dakota, we are what we consider citizen legislators. I spend more time at home than I do in the Capitol. I'm a realtor now. I have a background in higher ed. But when it comes to land management or agriculture, things like that, I mean, even Medicaid funding or behavioral health services, I have to depend on people I trust, whether that's advocates and lobbyists that are in the Capitol working on these issues, or people back home who it's their lived experiences or it's part of their profession or they have a personal or a deeper understanding of it to help me make better decisions. And so that's really, I think, a role that you all as advocates can play. Again, when we back up to having that relationship introduced or starting to be built well before the ask is there, but then being that content expert to legislators and by having those conversations ahead of time of understanding who your legislator is, you're going to know what motivates them. Again, when they share something, and then is there a way to tie in what you're advocating for with that motivation? If it's economic development or tourism, if it's making sure that kids have experiences and experiencing the outdoors, how do you tie those things into the end outcome that you're advocating for? Because you get to be those experts. I think of, and Chris knows as well, a common thing that came up for our discussions about protecting the wild horses on the legislative floors were the number of people who reached out and just told their personal stories about like seeing the horses for the first time and the magic that they felt, the beauty of that. And a number of legislators themselves had those experiences, but hearing from other folks from around North Dakota and even from outside of the state at times, if legislators were willing to listen about that impact of, yes, these might just be some horses grazing on land and you never think about them from day to day, but to a lot of people, they meant a lot. There's a lot of stories about family trips, the annual family trip, going camping in Western North Dakota, and the horses being a part of that experience. So it just kind of brought that fondness and those memories back for legislators, and it kind of took this idea that I don't want to say that what we're advocating for was divisive, but it was kind of the what we were trying to hold the federal government accountable. So that piece, but help people understand that it's more than just about managing horses. It's about, quality of life. It's about people enjoying the outdoors and making sure that we have beautiful spaces to visit with beautiful creatures to experience and whatnot. So, Yeah, that's my rambling way of saying I agree, Chris. Like you all being advocates and being content experts help us do our job, and can help again when I talk about staff. This staff person generally is someone in their 20s who enjoys public policy, and for most states, things like public lands or wildlife management uh, is probably not a big portfolio. It's probably like the 10th priority in that young person's portfolio. So, however, you can make it easier for them to have the information they need to do their job and to help advocate to the member, I think will pay off dividends for you all.
Craig wants to know, and I think that this will lead into another answer to something that I was going to ask you about. Do North Dakotans care about the TRMP wild horses themselves as individuals and also as a unique community of horses in their own right? And when you answer that, can you also talk about how you know that? Because I think that that's important.
Yeah, so I do think North Dakotans care about the horses. I don't know if they understand, and this is just out of my own ignorance, that the horses are there managed by the federal government, and the federal government then was having a say on whether or not we were going to have the horses anymore. So I think for many people, they just think these wild horses just exist, which is partially true, but they're also managed, and so again, going back to folks' personal experiences about those horses and what they mean, it was interesting because in North Dakota, as I've learned more about wild horse management and burros in my conversations with Chris and other advocates, especially Western area states, the horses or the burros are seen as nuisances, right? And so that's especially how landowners, cattle person, ranchers see them. And it was interesting because in North Dakota, there was actually able to be kind of I don't think it was a formal coalition, but our ranchers had concern about, well, the reason that the park wants to get rid of these horses is so that they can bring back some species that have been eradicated or less. Um, there's not as many of them around anymore, and that's going to mean our grazing abilities are going to be impacted and our ability to manage our private lands at time. And so so it kind of created this collaboration between local ranchers in Western North Dakota who had concerns about the parks management plan and saying, well, the horses don't bother us. We don't bother the horses, but we know if they get rid of the horses, there's going to be some other management plan coming in, and that's going to mean different species that may impact our ability to do what we've been doing for generations in North Dakota on public lands. Um, so I don't know if that answered your question, Craig, but I do think North Dakotans care. I think of, and Chris could probably tell us the breakdown of the engagement of folks on the membership list who reached out. But I had at least in my district, which each of our districts in North Dakota are 16,500 people, but I consistently heard from 5 people in my district alone who were advocates for the horses because of their experiences out there.
Can you talk about though too? I think another way that you were finding out that this was an issue were letters to the editor, because that was, I think, a huge thing in our state. I don't think that when the park made their announcement in December of 2022, I don't think that there was for a while a day, and I don't even think a week that went by where there were not letters to the editor in the paper just of the North Dakotans just expressing their outrage at the park's thoughts that they could just get rid of the horses.
No, you're spot on. There was a lot of engagement of local folks sending in those letters to the editor. And, I know some of that was, Chris helping people with that, but there was also just a lot of organic. Again, folks having their personal experiences of their childhood or their family vacations living out west in Western North Dakota. So, again, Fargo, we're on the east side. We're the largest city of 125,000 people, or excuse me, 137,000 people now in a state of just about 800,000. And we're part of a metro of 250,000 people. And so, yeah, there's a lot of people from a lot of parts of the state who now call Fargo Moorhead home. But, they were really engaged in the process and through those letters to the editor. And then the relationship that Chris was able to build with local media. We have a great journalist here. He's now retired, but he has some good investigative abilities. So he was really able to take this complex nature of, you know, federal wildlife management processes and what that means for our park, and break it down into some good several stories across a period of time to help people understand how this impacts the horses and, the different periods of times, specifically under different administrations of how management plans have evolved, and really make it, I think, accessible to folks to understand that again, these horses are part of our state and part of our culture, but they're part of a plan. They're being managed, and how does that impact us as North Dakotans?
I also wanted to just touch on something else that you said, just the importance of building relationships. Um, 4 years ago, I had no idea who Josh was. I'm probably 30 miles from the Montana border. He's right on the border of Minnesota. So we're literally on opposite ends of the state. But not just with Josh, with also it helped me build relationships with people, our local state legislators. Um, and then the other thing too I wanted to mention is the committees. When you have a bill and it ends up going into committee, depending on how many people are there to testify, you may only have 5 minutes to plead your case or what's important to you. And one of the things I did, and Josh had, I had conversations with Josh about this. I did meet with the committee chair personally before the committee hearing. And this gave me an opportunity just to sit with her kind of in a relaxed environment and say, hey, I'm not going to be able to say everything I need to say to you tomorrow, but this is why this is important. And this is why I'm asking it. And this is why it's here. And so that gave me a little bit more time to talk to her than I did in the actual committee meeting. One of the working group that we were trying to put together did not pass. It got a do not pass from the committee. And instead of just accepting that, I spoke with another retired state legislator here who said, "Go meet these guys outside of their meetings that they're having and talk to them on their way to their next one." And so I did that. Me and my husband spent the day at the Capitol, just sitting outside the committee hearing rooms. And when legislators would come out, I would walk and talk as fast as I could and had a one sheet page for them saying, hey, please vote for our legislation. Because when the committee hears it, like he said, it goes to the floor and the committee's kind of deciding, do we want to do this or not? Because again, they can't know everything that's happening, and be experts in everything. So they're expecting the committees who heard expert testimony to be the ones to say, hey, we don't think this should pass. So we fought to the end. And I think that that's important. Um, so here's a question for you from somebody else besides me. Krista says, thank you for speaking today. Do you discuss topics and bills with your colleagues, and would you see yourself and others trying to gain support for issues important to your residents? I know you're busy, but do you talk to others to gain their support and issues important to your neighbors?
Yes, absolutely. This is not meant to be a pat on my own back, but we have 141 legislators in North Dakota. Again, we're a citizen legislature. Each legislative district is 16,500 people, and each legislative district has one senator and two representatives. So I like to say North Dakotans are very well represented. My 16,500 people fit in a 28 blocks tall by 30 block wide district. There are districts out where Chris lives that goes from the South Dakota border up to the Badlands, through the Badlands. It's 7 counties, lots of square miles to get those 16,500 people in there. I say all that because I am probably one of the more engaged legislators. I take this very seriously, and again, part of that is driven by my desire to help other people get engaged in the process, so that we can do a better job of making good policy in our state. So I take the time of folks like Chris, who, I we got introduced because, and I should have started with that as part of our story. In one of my first sessions, I was on the House Agriculture Committee. Again, if you remember, I said I have no family background in agriculture. I was put there by the majority leader to not cause problems. And actually, ironically enough, the Agriculture Committee in North Dakota doesn't have a whole lot of legislation. So I had a lot of free time to create problems for the majority leader back then. But no, one of the bills we got, and I think it was the 13 or the 15 session, it was honoring the Nakota horse. And we were flooded inundated with thousands of emails from people around the world about protecting and making sure that the Dakota horse was continued to be recognized. Um, and I just remember how that volume of emails and engagement, again, for people, whether they were in North Dakota, within the United States, and across the world, like made legislative leaders say, we have to get this vote, like get the bill done, get it out of committee, get it on the floor. We need to get rid of this so that these emails stop because it's just flooding people's inboxes. And again, we answer our own emails. We don't have a staff person to go through all of that in North Dakota. So when I started to receive a large number of emails related to horses again, it brought me back to 10 years before, and I was like, "Whoa, I got to find out who's the leader, which organizations. I think there's a smarter way that we can do this. Let's have a conversation." Again, I'm from downtown Fargo. I've never, prior to that, I had never met the horses, um, but I just wanted to make sure that if this group was going to really advocate for these horses, that they knew how the process worked, and I had some ideas to share with them in terms of how to do that. And we had success in our first session with a resolution and then a second one. And in the meantime, our governor who became engaged in it because he was investing in the Teddy Roosevelt National Museum or National Library and Museum in the entrance of the park. He became this interior secretary. Our governor is from that part of the state now. It's just a lot of things happened in the interim that really, I think, helped us build a case and build some advocacy as Chris continues the work at the federal level protecting our horses. Um, and so to answer your question, I guess, do we talk to, I do a lot. And my colleagues, not, some of them do, some don't. But for me, it's more about doing the right thing and getting it passed. One thing we didn't start with is, I'm a Democratic leader in North Dakota. I'm one of 5 out of 47 in the Senate. There's only 5 Democrats, but I have a very high pass rate of my legislation because when I sit down and think about legislation I'm going to introduce, I want to make sure it's something that can be done. It can be done well collaboratively and getting stakeholder buy-in from not only outside of the legislature, but also my legislative colleagues. So, again, things like trying to advocate for the horses, we had both a policy bill and a resolution. What was our path forward? How do we make sure that we can do this and bring people along as we're trying to speed through the weeks of getting bills passed? So, and that's why I encourage others to just build those relationships with their legislators because, again, the small wins. North Dakota, many bills get passed the first time they're introduced because every bill gets introduced or every bill gets a hearing. Some states, a win might just be getting it out of committee. You might not win it on the floor vote that year, but you got out of committee. You know who some of your allies and supporters are, so that next year you have a new starting point to try to get it passed by the chamber then. And so it's really looking at those small wins based on how your legislative process is set up. Of course, getting a slam dunk your first year would be awesome. But more realistically, it's about how do you keep moving the ball forward, especially as things continue to evolve.
Isabella wants to know, for those of us in states that do not have wild horse herds, do we broach this topic with our state reps or U.S. reps?
Um, well, I'll certainly let Chris chime in on some of that based on both her state and federal advocacy. But, I think probably more of it is talking to your federal delegation because they're going to have a say. And again, they're probably not going to be paying attention to those bills as much. They might, but ironically enough, your person, if you have a member of Congress from, I'm just going to pick a state and it's probably going to be wrong because there's probably wild horses there, but let's just say Tennessee. But that member of Congress or that senator might actually sit on the Natural Resources Committee because there's something else they care about. And so they would have a deciding vote even though there aren't wild horses in their state that they represent, so they're not paying attention to wild horses conversation. Um, so, I think that's certainly something you could do to build up that network um, and I think then working with groups like Chasing Wild Horses, the other wild horse advocacy groups to identify who are those key legislators, and then finding members with or supporters from those states to reach out to those members.
And
There
also,
again,
John,
Greg corrected me. Tennessee's got wild horses, so.
well, and also I was going to say it was a good suggestion because Steve Cohen is a huge wild horse advocate for Western states. So he does that is kind of a different approach, but um, couldn't it also possibly just be part of the relationship that you make with your state legislators? Because I'm sure that you cross paths with Senator Hoeven, Senator Kramer, uh, Congresswoman Fedorchak every once in a while, and then couldn't you say, "Hey, I know that we don't have any wild horses here, but I'm hearing a lot from people that, please pass the SAFE Act, like they'd like you to support the SAFE Act or things like that."
I think exactly that. And, and your members, if again, if they're not as familiar with wild horses, are likely going to go talk to them. I mean, Chris, how many times have you gotten that? I forget which member of Congress you guys were visiting with. And the first thing they ask is, well, what does the Congress members of Congress in North Dakota think?
Right. That's
Right.
that's like
So
always the number one question they want to know. Yes.
yeah, yeah. So if you, they're going to go to the legislators directly. And again, this legislation we're working on, or the language within the budget bill is specific to North Dakota, but there's several other conversations happening with wild horses across the state or the country. Yeah.
So here's a question about if I reach out to people in North Dakota and don't live in your state, is that helpful?
Uh, it can be. I will tell you that a lot of our legislators, again, because we're the ones that manage our own inboxes, it's there's a lot of legislators who will say things like, well, the first emails I delete are people that aren't from my district or aren't from North Dakota. Um, but I think trying to figure out, is there a compelling argument? Again, the tourism, we hear a lot about that. Folks who come in, they come annually. It's the part of their family trip is to come see the horses. Of course, that's a lot of photographers and folks who are documenting the horses. But again, that means something to different legislators. But it's a tougher sell. But you never know. Your legislator from your state, if you're in Minnesota or any other state, might work with that legislature on one of our national organizations that we're a part of, or have a connection to a so then them hearing from a peer from that state may pay off as well. Or your member of your legislature, as a part of constituent service, may send a letter from their office to a legislator in North Dakota or a committee saying, we'd appreciate if you support the wild horses, or this is why it's important to our state, because we don't have horses, so we get to come to your state to see them, right? Um, so I think there's some angles to be played, but in all honesty, many of my peers in the North Dakota legislature would rather hear from North Dakotans or people in the state about some of those issues. Yeah.
But I think, Josh, also when it came to the horses, and um, I think a lot of the volume of communication that was coming from people from outside the state. And I know that was mentioned on the floor. I think every legislative session that we had stuff. I mean, it was noted that people are contacting us from all over the United States, and in some cases all over the world. So I do think it's always worth it. I think anytime that you can make your voice heard, I think that that's our job as citizen legislators, to make sure that we're just, if it's important to you, then you should speak up.
Yeah.
So
And I'll share with everyone, and I forget which, I think it was the Senate side, maybe it was the House side, when the bill was coming. I knew Chris was going to turn on our activation button, and your guys' membership list is wide and diverse, and the committee would be flooded. So I went to Chris and I said, hey, let's wait till, I don't remember if I said Sunday, to turn on that activation, because I know it's going to flood people's inboxes, and there's other business that they're working on. So let's try to time it so they at least get it 48 hours before the committee hearing or the vote. I don't remember which one it was, but I remember I had to go to Chris and say, before you unleash the beast on my peers and they come talking to me about all the emails they're getting, let's strategize that. So that was part of the gameship that we did, and I think it worked. Again, it was respectful of their time, but also we got the message across, and the advocates clearly were willing to hit the submit button. That's for sure.
and there were a lot of times too where I did have legislators reach out to me and say, "Hey, please let your people know that I am on board. Like they don't have to email me anymore." So those were always nice things too. So
Yep.
um,
Yep. All right. Well, as we get to our final 10 minutes together, one of the things that I'd like to talk about is, building a coalition or collaborating with others. So, again, my background comes out of organizing. We have power in numbers. So this is a visual I always like to show that, yes, there's the big fish, and the big fish might be eating us little ones individually, but when we combine together, we can push back and try to do some good things. Um, So, and some of those coalition members might be unlikely. Again, as we talk about wild horses and burros, it may not even be any groups that have anything to do with animals. Maybe it's something with land management, or it's tourism groups for that region, or economic development partners. I think again of the work Chris has was doing in on boots on the ground in Western North Dakota about going to the city council meeting, the county commission, the chamber of commerce, the Teddy Roosevelt folks, and a lot of them it was an easy yes for them. Some of them had a lot of questions for her, but she was able to then do that legwork. And then when she would go, it wasn't just wild horse or go to the legislature. She was able to bring letters of support or official actions that were taken by those other entities to build this coalition that really was a regional coalition having a conversation about the impact and the importance of the horses for Western North Dakota. But in those power of numbers also comes, shared expertise. So Chris is a staff of one. I don't know if her husband gets counted as a staff person too, other than being a chauffeur at times. But you know, when you're a staff of one, and a lot of nonprofits are just one person or a working board, other organizations might have tools that you can use. If it's the email database list or contacting folks and collecting information, shared constituencies. It's a way to get new supporters. There might be people, again, by engaging with groups like chambers of commerces or economic development tourism groups, their members may have their own personal experiences with, in our case, North Dakota, the wild horses and Teddy Roosevelt National Park, who then just come in and be supporters of your organization now. So there's that spillover effect that happens. So I know it ends up being a lot because the goal is you have your legislation you're introducing, but if you can identify organizations or like-minded entities that would have a shared concern, I think there's a lot of opportunity to build your power and your numbers that way. And then, as I've talked throughout the presentation, making sure that you're focusing on the small wins. A key piece of legislation that I had worked on a long time ago. I didn't know it until a national group had told me, but they framed it as, North Dakota was the first state to pass that bill in the first time it was introduced. Other states, it had taken 13 legislative sessions to get it out of committee. But that was where I learned about, well, our structure is different than other states, or I understood that our structure and our legislative process is different than other states. So that allowed that kind of framing to happen or that win, even though we didn't pass the bill, but we got it out of committee, right? And so we use that as our foundation going forward. I know we want things done now, but as legislation and policy making takes time. Another thing to think about is sometimes it's not always about legislation or getting things passed in the legislature. There are things like administrative rules. Different states have different levels of authority with different agencies, where the agencies can write rules around the authority that's granted to them by the state legislature. So maybe it's not always going the legislative path. Maybe it is seeing if there's things that can be done from an administrative executive branch partnership. Again, that was part of what our conversation evolved to here in the state as we were looking at is there a state agency that would house this working group? And so there were conversations with universities, there was conversations with the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Commerce, trying to see who, does this fit under tourism? Does it fit under agriculture with the ag? And then you start seeing, at least in our case, our agriculture commissioner is continuing to try to kind of build his footprint in level of responsibility in the state. So, if I remember correctly, Chris, he was interested in being a point agency with that at one point, and I don't know how we finished out with that, but he was interested, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, again, then finding a new ally within the administrative branch or the executive branch to help us with that. Um, and then, often within lots of different work, the work is hard, the days are long, emotions get high. So it's easy sometimes for whether it's individual egos or different perspectives, or individual comments or instances to create division and frustration. And that's natural. It's part of the forming process, storming, forming, norming. Um, but to always come back and center the work around the agreed upon policy outcome. So for us, again, in the state of North Dakota, it's how do we make sure that the horses are well managed, that North Dakotans have an ability to have appropriate and required input as part of that land management or the management of the herd. Um, and so, even though there might have been times where we got frustrated with each other or groups or individual stakeholders got frustrated, it's how do we get back to we have to put some of that stuff aside so that we can move forward and not let any of the divisiveness or personalities impact the outcome that we're shooting for, especially with those horses. So with that, this is my contact information. Or excuse me, I do have a challenge for everyone. This is something I commonly add is that over the next 30 days, you know, identify who your legislators are and introduce yourself. Get to know the candidates that are running for office in your legislative districts or in your communities. Different states have different structures and how those races happen. So, and then, of course, vote in every election. So often, we're in a midterm election. You're going to have primaries for your local offices. People don't vote. But if we can each do our best to find 10 people and have that relational conversation about needing to vote, that gets people more engaged in the process, more familiar. And then as topics that are important to you come up, you now have more folks who are willing to activate and participate in the process as part of that. So. Yeah, there's my contact information. If there's any follow-up or any follows on social media, but I'm happy to stick around for a few more minutes of questions. And Chris, if you have anything to add, let's go for it.
Um, so well, there's a question. So Andrea wants to know, so all wild horses across the US and on all public lands are owned literally by the citizens across the US. So she wonders, shouldn't state legislators listen to all the people even outside their state? I think part of that trick is that like we elect you. So I mean, that's why you're more inclined to listen to your constituents first. Is that
I think so, and the management of that, right? Again, it may be different if I had staff that were helping to run interception or helping manage those communications and telling me that I got 10 calls on this issue, but I'm the one managing that. In our instance here in North Dakota. But also, there are different philosophies on things. So you're exactly right. The horses are the property or the resources of the American citizenry. We as North Dakotans would say that they're ours. And that's a bigger conversation around hunting and gamemanship that we have in our state because we allow hunting on private lands. And that's a big debate that happens in terms of, private owner property rights versus the fact that deer and wild game and bird go on public and private lands. They travel around, but they're a resource. And so there's bigger kind of localized conversations that some of that plays into. But I do think it helps us as part of the conversation being localized, we recognize, and I think a lot of us have learned that, again, whether it was us pulling models from what Colorado does, learning more about, I forget which Carolina it is, North Carolina or South Carolina, that already has some protection, so we are part of a bigger fabric of this. And because the federal government has allowed, piecemealing of it, depending on whether it's type of land or which state or whatnot, instead of us having an overarching general protection, um, it has to be managed differently. So,
one of my one
yeah,
of my favorite quotes I think over the last 4 years came from Attorney General Drew Wrigley. And he said, yes, these horses are managed by the federal government, but they come under the stewardship of the
mm,
state of North Dakota. And I think that that's a good answer to that. Does that make more sense, maybe?
you're right. And that also helped us. I'm glad you brought that up, Chris, because again, when we go back to how I started the conversation, the fact that it's harder to get federal action. There's not a lot happening at the federal level, and more's coming back to the states, and we're having those conversations. We really framed it in 2023 with Governor Burgum, who's now Secretary of the Interior, and continued the conversation about North Dakota wants to be a partner in managing the herd. So whether that's our university systems with our researchers and our veterinarians, the State Department of Agriculture, the advocacy groups, the people who, the local economic, the Moorhead, or excuse me, the Medora Chamber of Commerce wanting a seat at the table, like we want to make sure that these horses are a part of our fabric for the next 125 years of our state as well. And so I should say 150, but yeah, you're exactly right. I think he worded that very well.
So another two more things I wanted to talk about. One is like why should we talk to our state legislators? And this is kind of how I see this umbrella, and I'd love your input on this. So we elect our federal legislators from North Dakota. Their job, I think, is to take our voice in North Dakota to Washington, D.C. and create change, right? So take our interest here in North Dakota. I think that where we miss as advocates, and I'm not saying it by any means like we all need to be contacting our federal legislators for a variety of things, but I think that contact your federal legislator becomes almost like the answer to everything. And if we don't have something that we want them to do, right? So like in this case, we wanted federal legislation for the horses in Theodore Roosevelt National Park. I think that what happened the last legislative session is a perfect um, timeline of how it's supposed to work, right? I was a concerned citizen. I came to you, one of our legislators, and said, hey, we should have federal protection for these horses because we just fought for 3 years for the government not to take them away. And you were like, hey, Chris, great idea. Let's see what we can do about that, right? So we created a resolution saying, hey, we want federal protection for these horses. That went to the and through the Senate and went through the House, got passed, and then it went on to our federal legislators. And then it became a request from not just Chris Command, right, in Dickinson, like one person. It was from the entire state of North Dakota saying, "Hey, we need federal protection for these horses." And within a couple of weeks, Senator Hoeven had introduced legislation. So I think that that's a really, and I know it seems it was not as simple as I made it sound. Um, there were legislators who we had a resolution a couple of years ago that just said, "Hey, we want to keep the horses in the park," and they didn't understand why we needed another resolution saying we need horses in the park. We were like, "No, but this one's saying federal legislation. There's a difference." I mean, so we even had to fight for that kind of a small wording. But isn't that how? I think that that's a great way to um, stress the importance of state legislative relationships and how it helps. So then when we contact Senator Hoeven's office, now we could say, hey, we want federal legislation, and we have something to back us up on that. Not just We're not just asking him for help for something and there's nothing for him to do.
Yeah, no, you're spot on. And then I think of all the in-between conversations, specifically Senator Hoeven, because of the committees he's on, has been able to have with the Park Service, right? Of being at the table. I mean, I think of I think it was it was our 2023 session. Governor Burgum called me, the majority leaders. I think Attorney General Drew Wrigley was in the room, and we got on a call with Senator Hoeven's office and the National Park Service. So it was basically the point of the conversation was we're all having the same conversation and we're all trying basically saying the same outcome. So it allowed the governor and Senator Hoeven to kind of firmly say some things to the Park Service about, you know, we're having this conversation. We care about this. So what are you going to do the right thing that's not going to necessarily force us to have to go do some legislation? And it was just interesting how a lot of those side conversations, and again, Chris, like you said, Senator Hoeven's office specifically, is able to invite the Park Service into his office to have a conversation from time to time, especially as administrations changed and park leaders changed, to remind them of this is the path we're heading on. And so there's some things you can do within your authority, and there are some things that we can do within our authority, and we should continue those conversations as we move it forward.
The other thing that I get all the time, because people ask me a lot, like, how did you do what you did? And I always say, you really need to get your state legislators on board because I feel like that was, again, Josh educated me so much. Thank you again. And just basic civics that we forget. Because I feel like that was one lesson over the last 4 years. Like we have civics class at the wrong time in life because um we forget it when we need it at these points. So but when I tell people, like get a relationship with your state legislators, a lot of people will say, we're a red state, they don't care. Um, and one, can you talk about how red North Dakota is? Um, and two, do you have advice for that? Like, how do you get them to care in other red states when, most of the red states, like they're dealing with the cattle industry or ranching industries and those interests. Um, but how do we get our legislators, especially in those red states, to listen to our voices?
Well, as you remember, for us, part of it is I tapped into that redness, right? I tapped into the fact that for how many years the legislature sent resolutions to the federal government under the Obama and Biden administration saying, knock it off, leave our energy development alone, our agriculture industry. So this idea that, our state is fiercely independent and we don't like the federal government telling us what to do. I was able to spin that into the Park Service is doing some things we don't think we want them doing with our horses. Don't should that make you mad too? And they're like, hell yeah, the big bad federal government needs to back off, and they're and and again, then it switched, a little bit with Governor Burgum's leadership in terms of how do we be a partner. There had been some other things that were being done within the park to, as we prepare to open the library. So these things kind of worked out. But even in a very conservative state, it was how do we tap into those conservative values or ideas to support the importance of for us in this case managing the herd and Teddy Roosevelt. So. Um, yeah, so it got a lot of them to care because it was able to shift the conversation from, um, you know, be an environmentalist or protect these pretty little horses to the federal government's trying to tell us how to do it. We know best what's best for our horses, and they should listen to us. And I think that really helped get a lot of folks on board. Because again, a lot of these folks, myself included, until I met Chris and received the emails, don't really think about the horses and don't even know they exist sometimes, and so that got people to understand, again, we have this great resource in our state. um, we need to be a partner with the federal government and how we be good stewards, how we manage the herd, and make sure that they're here for generations to come.
Do you think that there's a benefit to reaching out to the any if you're in a red state, like reaching out to Democratic legislators like yourself? Is there I guess I don't know if you can speak to that at all. Like if you're not getting anywhere with your Republican ones, is there ways that the Democratic legislators can possibly help?
So yeah, the reality is obviously in most news, you only see us fighting, right? The headlines are about the controversial bills, and we're fighting about different things. You don't hear about the fact that, some of my closest friends are Republican legislators who I learn a lot from, they learn a lot from me, and we do, for lack of a better word, our horse trading, not on the front pages of the newspaper. And so, yeah, I think any of those relationships, regardless of the political makeup of your legislature, of whether you have a Republican or Democratic governor, your congressional delegation is just educating all of us, and you'll find that we all. Um, again, I have the respect of a lot of those Republican legislators from Western North Dakota because they didn't necessarily want to lead on the issue, but I kept telling them, I'll do the background issue, I'll do the organizing, I'll do whatever, and then set them up for success. And now they partner with me on my bills, on other things, and so we've built this friendship and this partnership around respect, and I think that exists more than people think right now. It's waning. I'll be honest about that. It is harder and harder for us to build relationships with folks, uh, because some of the new crop of legislators coming into states and even members of Congress, may not even know where they stand personally on stuff. But if you can connect on that personal level about shared values or shared understanding of things, some of the legislators I work the most with are ones that 90% of the time we don't vote the same way, but it's that 10% issue that we agree on, that we were able to do some great things this last session on.
All right. Yeah, Isabella said stewardship should be the default word, especially for those of us who are fighting on behalf of the horses, not management. There's a difference in the meaning
Yeah,
is it really is. Yes. It was a great quote from him, and I used it as often as I could over the last
yeah,
4 years. So
yeah.
anybody else have any questions for Josh before he heads off? I appreciate your time. Josh is also, so everyone knows, running for mayor of Fargo. So I do wish him all the best, and I hope that he wins. But I will miss you dearly if I have to go back into the legislative session. But I've made a lot of other friends. So and that's I think one of the other things too. The neat thing about working with state legislators is that, like he said, when I want to talk to Senator Hoeven, I think I've talked to Senator Hoeven maybe once or twice in the last 4 years. I talked to his policy person or whatever. When I call our state legislators, like they answer the phone, they're like, "Hey, Chris, what's going on?" So, or don't answer the phone, and then sometimes I'm like, "Oh," or my husband jokes like, "Yeah, they don't want to talk to you today." But it's great to have this relationship, and it really does open up doors. I feel like to a federal level. So I hope that this was helpful to everybody. And Josh, again, thank you so much for your time and good luck on your run for mayor of Fargo.
Well, thanks for your work and the work of everyone on here. It's important. I think so often in policymaking, especially now where things, and I think we're we border Minnesota, and what's happening in Minneapolis with with immigration enforcement is weighing really heavy on a lot of us. But um, there are these small wins and these opportunities to do good, and if we all did a little good where we're standing in that day, it'll help keep us moving forward. We don't have to do it all at once. And so, again, what I've been able to learn about the wild horses, about our relationship and their history in our state, and the work that Chris is doing and so many others, it helps me find value too, and get out there and remember the beauty of Western North Dakota. So keep up the great work, you all, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
Thank you again. And thank you, everybody. I'll see you at 4 o'clock for our next presentation. Thank you again, Josh. Everyone have a great
Yeah,
day.
thank you. Yep, bye.